14th of February 2013. In the early hours of the morning, the silence inside one of Pretoria's most exclusive gated community was shattered by gunfire. Neighbours would later describe hearing 4 rapid shots. Some heard shouting, others heard screams. Within minutes, security guards were rushing towards a luxury home. Behind a locked bathroom door lay a young woman named Reeva Steenkamp. She was 29 years old, a successful model, a law graduate, a campaigner against violence towards women. She was fighting for her life. The man desperately trying to save her wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a burglar. He wasn't a criminal known to police. He was Oscar Pistorius, one of the most famous athletes on the planet, a man whose extraordinary journey had inspired millions. Just months earlier, he'd walked into London's Olympic Stadium to deafening applause, a double amputee who'd refused to accept the limits others placed upon him. To many, he was the embodiment of determination, a symbol that impossible dreams could become reality. Children looked up to him, world leaders praised him, sponsors lined up to work with him. The world knew him simply as the Blade Runner. But before the sun rose that Valentine's morning, that remarkable story had taken a turn nobody could have imagined. The man who had become one of the greatest sporting icons of his generation was about to find himself at the centre of one of the most scrutinised murder investigations in modern history. The question that would divide experts, journalists, lawyers and millions watching around the world wasn't whether Oscar Pistorius fired the shots. He admitted that he did. The question was far more complicated. Why? Was it a tragic mistake made in fear? Or was it murder? For more than a decade, that question has continued to provoke fierce debate. This is the story of astonishing triumph, devastating loss, and one of the most dramatic falls from grace the sporting world has ever seen. Welcome back to What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. I'm Matt, and I'm your host. If you'd like to support the show, you'll find the Buy Me a Coffee link in the episode description. You can also follow the podcast on all the socials, and if you'd like to suggest a case or get in touch, you'll find all the details below. And as always, if you enjoy the show, please consider following the podcast, leaving a rating and sharing it with someone else. It genuinely helps more people discover the show and allows me to keep bringing you these stories. Before we begin, this episode contains discussions of violent death, domestic violence, and distressing themes that some listeners may find distressing. Alright, let's crack on with the show. Long before the stadiums, before the medals, before the television interviews, and long before the courtroom cameras, there was simply a little boy called Oscar. Oscar Leonard Carl Pistorius was born in Johannesburg, South Africa, on the 22nd of November 1986. Within days, doctors delivered news that would change the course of his life forever. He had been born without the fibula bones in either leg. The condition was exceptionally rare. His parents were faced with an impossible decision. Without surgery, Oscar's future mobility would be severely limited. The medical advice was clear. Before his first birthday, both of his lower legs would need to be amputated below the knee. For any parent, the thought is almost unbearable. Yet Oscar's mother, Sheila, refused to let disability become his identity. Years later, Oscar would often repeat the lesson she taught him as a child. You're different, not disabled. Whether it was climbing trees, playing rugby with friends, or racing across a playground, she encouraged him to compete alongside able-bodied children, rather than sheltering him from the world. He learned almost immediately that if something was difficult, he would simply have to find another way. Artificial legs became part of everyday life. Changing prosthetics wasn't unusual, it was routine. Every growth spurt meant new adjustments, new challenges, new frustrations. But quitting was never part of the conversation. As a child, Oscar wasn't obsessed with athletics. He loved sport in almost every form: water polo, cricket, rugby union, tennis, wrestling. Anything competitive seemed to ignite something inside him. Teachers described him as fiercely determined. Friends remembered someone who hated losing. That relentless competitive streak would become one of his defining characteristics. It drove him through setbacks that would have stopped most people. It also helped shape the public image that millions would later admire. To the outside world, Oscar Pistorius became the smiling athlete who never accepted limitations. But behind every inspirational headline was years of pain. Hours spent adapting to new prosthetic limbs, training harder than almost anyone around him, and constantly trying to prove he belonged. By his late teens, one thing had become obvious. Oscar wasn't just good, he was extraordinary. At first, athletics wasn't even his main focus. It almost found him by accident. A serious rugby injury forced him away from the sport he loved. His rehabilitation introduced him to sprint training. Within months, coaches realised they weren't looking at someone trying athletics for fun. They were looking at one of the fastest Paralympic sprinters the world had ever seen. Oscar had discovered the sport that would transform his life. He couldn't possibly know it then, but that injury hadn't ended one dream. It had started another. One that would eventually carry him all the way to the biggest sporting stage on earth, and in doing so, turn him into one of the most famous athletes of the 21st century. By the early noughties, Oscar Pistorius had found the sport that would define his life: sprinting. It started almost by accident. A rugby injury had forced him away from the game he loved, and during his rehabilitation a coach encouraged him to try athletics. Almost immediately, it became obvious this wasn't just another young athlete looking for a new hobby. Oscar was frighteningly quick. Within months, he was competing against some of the best Paralympic athletes in the world. Within a few years, he was beating them. In 2004, at just 17 years old, Oscar travelled to Athens for his first Paralympic Games. Most teenagers his age were thinking about exams, university or their first jobs. Oscar was standing on the biggest stage in disability sport. He won bronze in the 100 metres. Then came the 200 metres. The teenager stunned the field. He crossed the line first. Paralympic champion. Just like that, a new star had arrived. South Africa embraced him. The sporting world began to take notice. Over the next 4 years he became almost unstoppable. World records fell. Gold medals accumulated. Every race seemed to reinforce the same message. Oscar Pistorius wasn't just the fastest double amputee in the world. He was redefining what people believed was physically possible. But as his success grew, so did the controversy. Oscar ran using carbon fibre prosthetic limbs, manufactured by the Icelandic company Osur. They became famous around the world as the Flexfoot cheetah blades. To millions watching, they were remarkable pieces of engineering. To some of his competitors, they represented something else entirely. Questions began to emerge. Were the blades simply replacing what he'd lost, or were they giving him an advantage? Scientists argued, athletes argued, officials argued. The debate became one of the biggest controversies in modern athletics. Some researchers believed the blades returned less energy than a biological leg. Others suggested they offered mechanical advantages in areas such as energy expenditure and leg swing. There wasn't a simple answer. What began as a scientific discussion quickly became an emotional one. Was Oscar breaking barriers, or breaking the rules? In 2008, World Athletics governing body ruled that his prosthetics gave him an unfair advantage and barred him from competing against able-bodied athletes. For many people, it looked like the end of an impossible dream. But Oscar refused to accept the decision. He appealed to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. The case attracted worldwide attention. It wasn't simply about one athlete. It raised profound questions. What does fairness really mean in elite sport? How should technology be balanced against human ability? And where should the line be drawn? After reviewing extensive scientific evidence, the Court of Arbitration for Sport overturned the ban. Oscar Pistorius was cleared to compete. The decision made headlines across the globe. He wasn't just a Paralympian anymore. He'd become one of the most recognisable athletes in the world. Endorsement deals followed, magazine covers, television interviews, motivational speeches. Everywhere he went, people wanted to hear his story. He inspired children living with disabilities. He inspired athletes. He inspired people who had never watched a race in their lives. To millions, Oscar Pistorius represented hope. A man who had overcome unimaginable obstacles through sheer determination. But there was still one mountain left to climb. The Olympic Games. No athlete with double below knee amputations had ever competed against the world's best able-bodied sprinters. Many believed it would never happen. Oscar believed otherwise. Every training session, every race, every sacrifice, every headline, they were all leading towards one destination. London, the summer of 2012, a city preparing to welcome the world, an Olympic Games that would capture the imagination of a generation, and a moment that would transform Oscar Pistorius from an extraordinary athlete into a global icon. There are moments in history when sport becomes something bigger than winning. Moments that transcend medals, records, and national pride. The summer of 2012 was one of those moments. For 2 extraordinary weeks, London became the centre of the world. The streets were lined with flags, train stations overflowed with supporters wearing the colours of dozens of nations. The underground buzzed with excitement from dawn until long after midnight. Volunteers greeted visitors with smiles that became famous across the globe. The city seemed to breathe as one. For Britain, these weren't just Olympic Games. They were a celebration, a chance to show the world what the country could do. By the time the athletics programme began, the atmosphere inside the Olympic Stadium was unlike anything many spectators had ever experienced. 80,000 voices, every seat filled, television cameras broadcasting live to hundreds of millions of people across the globe. For an athlete, there was no bigger stage. And on that stage, Oscar Pistorius was about to make history. It had taken years of legal battles, scientific studies, arguments over fairness, questions about technology, countless interviews defending his right to compete. Now, none of that mattered. He had made it. When Oscar walked onto the blue track wearing the green and gold of South Africa, it wasn't simply another athlete entering a stadium. For many people watching, it felt like history unfolding in real time. The applause wasn't reserved for the fastest runner. It was for the journey, for the child who had had both of his legs amputated before his first birthday, for the teenager who had been told there were limits to what he could achieve, for the athlete who had refused to accept them. Commentators described the moment with genuine emotion. Around the world, newspapers called him an inspiration. Children with disabilities watched someone who looked like them, standing shoulder to shoulder with the very best athletes on earth. For perhaps the first time in Olympic history, millions weren't talking about whether someone could win. They were talking about what it meant to simply be there. Oscar competed in the 400 metres. He successfully progressed through the heats. When he crossed the finish line and secured a place in the semi-finals, another piece of history had been written. No double-amputee athlete had ever gone that far in an Olympic track event. His journey eventually ended in the semi-finals against some of the fastest men in the world. But defeat barely seemed relevant. The achievement itself was enough. Then came another remarkable moment. Oscar was selected to run for South Africa in the men's 4x400 metre relay. Standing alongside his teammates, he wasn't viewed as a novelty. He was simply another member of an Olympic relay squad. Years of determination had earned him that place. Nothing else. When the games came to an end, the images travelled around the world. Oscar smiling, Oscar embracing fellow athletes, Oscar standing proudly in South African colours. The Blade Runner had become one of the defining images of London 2012. But his summer wasn't over. Just weeks later, London welcomed the Paralympic Games. If the Olympics had introduced Oscar Pistorius to millions, the Paralympics reminded everyone why he had become famous in the first place. The crowds returned. The noise somehow became even louder. Night after night, packed stadiums celebrated athletes whose performances shattered expectations. Oscar once again found himself at the centre of attention. He won 2 gold medals, he added a silver. He left London as one of the most recognisable athletes on the planet. Corporate sponsors wanted him. Television producers wanted him. Magazine editors wanted him. His face appeared on front of pages across the world. His story was told in classrooms. His achievements featured in motivational speeches. Parents pointed him out to their children as proof that determination could overcome almost any obstacle. To millions, Oscar Pistorius represented courage, resilience, hope. Few people could have imagined that they had already witnessed the highest point of his life. Because while the world celebrated one of the sport's greatest success stories, away from the cameras, another chapter was beginning. Oscar had started a relationship with a successful model, law graduate and television personality named Reeva Steenkamp. Friends described them as glamorous, successful. Photographers couldn't get enough of them. Together, they looked like one of South Africa's golden couples. From the outside, everything appeared perfect. But history has a cruel habit of hiding its darkest chapters behind its brightest moments. Within 6 months of leaving London, everything the world believed about Oscar Pistorius would be turned upside down. And in the early hours of Valentine's Day, the man who had inspired millions would make a phone call that would change both their lives forever. By the beginning of 2013, Oscar Pistorius appeared to have everything. He was 26 years old, one of the most recognisable athletes on earth, financially secure, internationally famous, admired by millions. His rise had been so remarkable that many people believed they were watching one of the greatest sporting stories ever told. Away from the track, his personal life also seemed to be falling into place. Months earlier, He had begun a relationship with Reeva Steenkamp. Born in Cape Town, Reeva was far more than the glamorous image many newspapers chose to portray. She had a law degree, she had built a successful modelling career, she was intelligent, ambitious, and articulate. Friends described her as warm, driven, and compassionate. She had spoken publicly about tackling violence against women and was passionate about using her profile to support charitable causes. Together, Oscar and Reeva quickly became one of South Africa's most photographed couples. Every public appearance attracted attention. Magazine covers, television interviews, red carpet events. To the outside world they looked happy, young, successful, the kind of couple newspapers loved to feature. But fame has a way of distorting reality. Photographs captured only fractions of a second. They couldn't reveal what life was like once the cameras had disappeared. Friends would later describe Oscar as intensely competitive, not only in sport, but in everyday life. He loved fast cars, he enjoyed firearms and spent time at shooting ranges. Those interests were no secret. He owned several legally licensed guns and had spoken openly about believing in the importance of protecting himself and his home. South Africa has one of the highest violent crime rates in the world, and many residents of gated communities kept firearms for personal protection. That context would later become a central part of Oscar's account of what happened. On Valentine's Day, 2013, Reeva posted a message on social media expressing her excitement for the day ahead. It was cheerful, optimistic. No one reading it could possibly have imagined what would unfold just hours later. That evening, Reeva travelled to Oscar's home in the Silverwoods country estate, an exclusive gated community on the eastern outskirts of Pretoria. Security at the estate was tight. High walls, controlled access, regular patrols. It was designed to be one of the safest places to live. Inside the house, the evening appeared uneventful. The couple spent time together. They ate dinner. Television was on for part of the evening. At some point, they went upstairs to bed. There is no reliable evidence to suggest anyone else entered the house that night. No sign of a forced break-in was found. Outside, the estate gradually fell silent. Neighbours settled into bed. Security guards continued their routine patrols. Nothing appeared unusual. Nothing suggested that, before dawn, the estate would become the focus of one of the biggest crime stories in the world. Shortly after 3 a.m, the silence was broken. Some neighbours would later report hearing raised voices. Others said they heard what sounded like screams. Accounts differed, and those differences would become fiercely contested during the trial. Then came the sound everyone agreed upon. Gunshots, 4 of them, rapid, echoing across the estate. Within moments, lights flicked on in neighbouring homes. People looked through curtains. Some reached for their telephones. Others stepped onto balconies trying to work out what had happened. Inside Oscar Pistorius' home, events were unfolding that investigators would spend years trying to reconstruct. By sunrise, Reeva Steenkamp would be dead. Oscar Pistorius would be in tears. Police officers would be making their way through the gates. And a story that had inspired the world was about to become one of the most controversial criminal investigations of the 21st century. The question now wasn't whether something terrible had happened. It was understanding exactly how, and whether the truth inside that house matched the story the world was about to hear. It was the early hours of Thursday, the 14th of February, 2013, Valentine's Day. Most of the Silverwoods country estate was asleep. Streetlights illuminated quiet roads. Security guards continued their routine patrols. Behind the high walls of one of the estate's most exclusive homes, Oscar Pistorius and Reeva Steenkamp had gone to bed. What happened next would become one of the most fiercely contested sequences of events in modern criminal history. Some parts are beyond dispute, others remain deeply contested to this day. What is certain is that, shortly after 3 a.m, 4 shots were fired through the locked door of a small toilet cubicle inside Oscar Pistorius' bathroom. Behind that door was Reeva Steenkamp. She suffered catastrophic injuries. Oscar Pistorius has always maintained that he believed an intruder was hiding inside the toilet. According to this account, he woke during the night, believed there was a burglar in the bathroom, and fearing for his life and Reeva's safety, picked up his licensed 9mm pistol. He said he did not realise Reeva was no longer in bed. Believing she was still behind him in the bedroom, he moved towards the bathroom. He later said he shouted for the person inside the toilet to come out. Receiving no response, he fired 4 shots through the closed door. Only afterwards, he said, did he realise Reeva was missing. He claimed that was the moment he understood she had been inside the toilet. The prosecution presented a very different case. They argued that Oscar knew Reeva was behind the door, that the shooting followed an argument, and that the shots were fired intentionally. Those competing accounts would dominate the trial. But before either side entered the courtroom, investigators had to establish one thing. What had actually happened inside that house? Neighbours became some of the first crucial witnesses. Several reported hearing loud bangs. Some described hearing a woman screaming. Others recalled hearing a man shouting. The precise timing and sequence of those sounds became one of the most heavily debated aspects of the case. Memories differed, interpretations differed, and during cross-examination, those differences were examined in extraordinary detail. Inside the house, Oscar was desperately trying to reach Reeva. The locked toilet door had to be broken open. Using a cricket bat, he smashed through panels in the wooden door. Once access was gained, Reeva was carried from the small cubicle. Despite Oscar's efforts to help her, her injuries were unsurvivable. Emergency services were called. Paramedics arrived, but there was nothing they could do. At just 29 years old, Reeva Steenkamp was pronounced dead. Outside, the first police officers arrived at the estate. The gates that had been designed to keep danger out now held back journalists, photographers and television crews as word began to spread. At first the report seemed impossible to believe. Oscar Pistorius, the Olympic hero, the man millions had applauded only months before. By dawn, the story had crossed continents. Rolling news channels interrupted their schedules. Front pages were rewritten. Within hours, one question echoed around the world. How had one of the most inspirational athletes of his generation become the central figure in a homicide investigation? The answer would depend not only on witness testimony, but on bloodstains, bullet trajectories, phone records, forensic science, and the painstaking reconstruction of every movement made inside that house before 4 shots shattered the silence. Because in a courtroom, emotion can persuade, but evidence has to stand on its own, and that evidence would soon become the focus of one of the most closely watched murder trials in modern history. By the time daylight spread across Pretoria, the house that had once symbolised Oscar Pistorius' extraordinary success had become a crime scene. The driveway filled with police vehicles. Forensic specialists carried cameras, evidence bags and measuring equipment through the front door. Outside the gates, journalists from around the world began to gather. Satellite trucks lined the roads. Television presenters delivered live reports with very little confirmed information. Within hours, one of the biggest sporting names on the planet, had become the focus of an international murder investigation. Inside the house, however, there were no headlines, only evidence. Every room was photographed exactly as investigators found it. Every item was recorded, every bloodstain documented, every spent cartridge case marked where it lay. The staircase, the bedroom, the bathroom, the narrow toilet cubicle, nothing could be overlooked, because somewhere inside those rooms was the sequence of events that would either support Oscar Pistorius' account or contradict it. Investigators quickly established several facts that neither side disputed. 4 shots had been fired through the locked toilet door. The weapon used was Oscar Pistorius' licensed 9mm pistol. Reeva Steenkamp had been inside the cubicle when the shots were fired. After the shooting, the toilet door had been broken open with a cricket bat. Those facts formed the foundation of the case. Everything else depended on interpretation. The prosecution believed the physical evidence pointed towards a confrontation that ended in murder. The defense argued the same evidence was entirely consistent with a tragic mistake made by a man who genuinely believed an intruder was hiding behind the door. That distinction would become the battleground of the trial. Forensic experts examined the position of the bullet holes, the angle of the shots, the damage to the wooden door, the injuries Reeva suffered. They reconstructed movements inside one of the smallest rooms in the house, trying to understand where she had been standing and what had happened in the seconds before the gunfire. Every conclusion would later be challenged by the opposing side. Outside the forensic investigation, detectives widened their inquiries. They spoke to neighbours, security personnel, friends, family members. Telephone records were secured, messages were reviewed. Investigators worked to build a picture not only of what happened that night, but of the relationship leading up to it. As the investigation gathered pace, another debate was already beginning in newspapers and television studios across the world. Who was Oscar Pistorius? To millions, he was still the inspirational athlete who had captivated London during the Olympic Games. To others, reports began to emerge describing a fiercely competitive man with a passion for firearms, fast cars and adrenaline. Some former acquaintances spoke positively about him. Others described incidents that they believed painted a more volatile picture. Not every claim would ultimately be accepted as reliable evidence in court. Some never progressed beyond media reporting. Others were tested under cross-examination. Separating fact from rumour quickly became one of the greatest challenges for anyone trying to understand the case. And that challenge still exists today. It's one of the reasons this case remains so divisive. Not because people disagree that Reeva Steenkamp died, not because anyone disputes that Oscar Pistorius fired the shots, but because reasonable people have continued to disagree about what those moments meant. Was this a deliberate act, or a catastrophic mistake born from fear? As investigators continued their work, another chapter was beginning. Not in a laboratory, not inside the house, but in a courtroom. A courtroom where every piece of evidence would be scrutinised, every witness challenged, every word weighed, and where one of the most famous athletes in the world would have to answer the most serious accusation imaginable: murder. On the 3rd of March 2014, just over a year after Reeva Steenkamp's death, Oscar Pistorius walked into the High Court in Pretoria. The man who had once walked into the London Olympic Stadium to applause now entered through a crowd of photographers shouting his name. Camera shutters fired almost continuously. Television crews from every corner of the world had gathered outside. This wasn't just another murder trial. It had become one of the most closely watched criminal cases of the 21st century. Inside the courtroom sat two families. One had lost a daughter, the other feared losing a son to prison. No matter what the verdict would eventually be, neither family would ever leave that courtroom whole again. The prosecution alleged that Oscar Pistorius had intentionally killed Reeva Steenkamp after an argument. Their case was that she had sought refuge behind the locked toilet door and that Oscar knowingly fired 4 shots through it. The defence accepted that Oscar had fired the shots. There was never any dispute about that. Instead, they argued that he had made a catastrophic mistake. They said he genuinely believed an intruder had entered the house. Living in a country where violent home invasions were a real fear for many residents, Oscar reacted, they argued, in panic rather than anger. Everything would come down to intent. The prosecution didn't need to prove Oscar fired the gun. They needed to prove that this was in his mind when he pulled the trigger. This is one of the hardest things any court is ever asked to determine, because no one can see inside another person's thoughts. The courtroom soon became a battle between witness testimony, forensic science and human psychology. Neighbours described hearing sounds from the house during the early hours. Some believed they heard a woman screaming before the gunshots. Others described hearing shouting. The defence challenged aspects of those accounts, pointing to differences in what individual witnesses remembered and arguing that memories formed under stress are not always identical. The evidence was painstakingly examined, sometimes minute by minute, sometimes second by second. Every timeline was questioned, every inconsistency explored, every possibility tested. Then came the moment the world had been waiting for. Oscar Pistorius took the witness stand. He spoke quietly, often emotionally. At times his voice cracked. He described waking during the night and believing there was an intruder inside the bathroom. He told the court he both feared for his life and Reeva's. He said he armed himself with his pistol before moving towards the bathroom, believing Reeva was still in bed behind him. He fired through the toilet door. Only afterwards, he said, did he realise she was missing. As he recounted those moments, Oscar broke down in tears. Court proceedings were interrupted more than once as he struggled to continue. For some watching, his emotion appeared genuine. For others, it changed nothing. The prosecution's cross-examination would become one of the defining moments of the trial. They challenged almost every aspect of his account. If he believed Reeva was still in bed, why hadn't he checked? Why fire through a closed door without knowing who was behind it? Why, if he feared an intruder, did events unfold in the way he described? Each answer prompted another question. Each explanation was tested against the forensic evidence. Each inconsistency was explored in detail. The defence pushed back just as firmly. They argued that panic doesn't always produce rational decisions, that fear can distort judgment, that people confronted with what they genuinely believe to be a life-threatening situation don't always necessarily stop to consider every alternative. Day after day the courtroom listened. Experts disagreed, lawyers argued, journalists filled notebooks. Around the world millions formed opinions long before the judge reached hers. Some became convinced Oscar Pistorius had deliberately murdered Reeva Steenkamp. Others believed they were watching a devastated man, trying to explain an unimaginable mistake. The trial became about far more than one night's events. It became a debate about fear, about intention, about responsibility, and about how impossible it can sometimes be to know exactly what happened when only 2 people were present, and only one survived to tell the story. Eventually, after months of evidence, testimony and argument, the time came for Judge Fakazil Masipa to deliver her verdict. A decision that would shock many people watching around the world. After months of testimony, hundreds of exhibits, dozens of witnesses, and countless hours of legal argument, the courtroom fell silent. On the 12th of September 2014, Judge Fokozile Masipa began reading her judgment. Across South Africa, televisions were switched on. News organisations interrupted their schedules. Around the world, millions waited to hear one answer. Was Pistorius guilty of murder? The judgment was detailed, methodical. The judge carefully explained that criminal courts do not decide cases on emotion, public opinion, or media speculation. They decide them on evidence. She concluded that the prosecution had not proved beyond reasonable doubt that Oscar Pistorius intended to kill Reeva Steenkamp. She also found that the evidence did not establish beyond reasonable doubt that there had been an argument immediately before the shooting. Those findings meant the charge of murder had not been proved. For many people watching, it was an astonishing moment. Oscar Pistorius was found not guilty of murder. But the case wasn't over. Judge Masipa found him guilty of culpable homicide, the South African legal equivalent of causing another person's death through negligent rather than intentional conduct. The judge accepted that a reasonable person in Oscar's position should have foreseen that firing 4 high-caliber rounds through a closed toilet door could kill whoever was behind it. Even if he genuinely believed an intruder was inside, those shots, she concluded, were fired recklessly. It was a judgment that immediately divided opinion. Some believed justice had been done. Others argued the law had failed Reeva Steenkamp. Outside the courthouse, television cameras captured every reaction. Oscar Pistorius appeared overwhelmed. Members of Reeva's family listened quietly. There were no celebrations, no sense of victory, only grief. Because whatever legal definition the court applied, a young woman had still lost her life. Weeks later, Oscar Pistorius was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for culpable homicide. Given South African sentencing rules at the time, many legal commentators noted he could become eligible for release under supervision after serving part of that sentence. That prospect sparked intense public debate. Many questioned whether the punishment reflected the seriousness of the case. The National Prosecuting Authority also had serious concerns. Prosecutors believed the trial judge had made an error in law when assessing Oscar's intent. Importantly, they didn't simply disagree with the outcome. They argued that the legal test for dolus eventualis, a form of intent recognised in South African law, had been applied incorrectly. In simple terms, the prosecution argued something fundamental. It didn't matter whether Oscar Pistorius believed Reeva Steenkamp or an intruder was behind the toilet door. If he intentionally fired 4 shots into a confined space, knowing whoever was inside could die, that could still amount to murder. It was a subtle legal distinction, but it would change everything. The case moved to South Africa's Supreme Court of Appeal. Once again, the world turned its attention to Oscar Pistorius. Only this time, the question was no longer what had happened inside the house. The facts themselves had changed very little. Instead, the appeal judges were being asked something even more significant. Had the law itself been applied correctly? Because if it hadn't, Oscar Pistorius wasn't facing a new trial. He was facing the possibility that his conviction would be changed from culpable homicide to murder. By the end of 2014, many people believed the Oscar Pistorius case was over. The trial had finished, the verdict had been delivered, a sentence had been imposed. For most criminal cases, that would have been the end. but not this one. The National Prosecuting Authority believed something had gone fundamentally wrong. Not with the evidence, not with the witnesses, not with the forensic science, but with the law itself. They appealed. Importantly, they were not asking another court to hear new evidence or call new witnesses. They weren't trying to prove a different sequence of events inside the house. Instead, they argued that the trial judge had made an error when interpreting South African criminal law. It sounds technical, but the consequences would be enormous. At the heart of the appeal was a legal principle known in South Africa as dolus eventualis. It's not a phrase most people have heard before, yet it became the single most important concept in the entire case. Imagine someone deliberately fires a gun into a room, knowing another person is inside. They may not know exactly who they're going to hit. They may not even care who it is. But if they understand there's a real possibility someone will die and choose to pull the trigger anyway, the law may regard that as intent. That was, in essence, the prosecution's argument. They said it didn't matter whether Oscar Pistorius believed the person behind the toilet door was Reeva Steenkamp or an unknown intruder. The critical question was this: did he intentionally fire 4 shots through a locked door, knowing that whoever was behind it could be killed? If the answer was yes, then under South African law, the prosecution argued that amounted to murder. The appeal judges agreed. In December 2015, the Supreme Court of Appeal overturned the culpable homicide conviction. Oscar Pistorius was now legally guilty of murder. It was one of the most dramatic reversals in modern criminal justice. The facts of the case hadn't changed. The witness statements hadn't changed. The forensic evidence hadn't changed. What changed was the court's interpretation of the law. For Reeva Steenkamp's family, it marked another painful chapter in a journey they had never chosen. For Oscar Pistorius, it meant returning to court to be sentenced again. In July 2016, he received a 6-year prison sentence for murder. That sentence immediately attracted criticism. Many legal commentators believed it was too lenient given the seriousness of the offence. Once again, prosecutors appealed. The matter returned to the courts. In November 2017, the Supreme Court of Appeal increased Oscar Pistorius' sentence to 13 years and 5 months. The judges concluded that the original 6-year sentence was shockingly lenient and didn't properly reflect the gravity of the crime. By then, the Olympic hero, who had once inspired millions, had become a prisoner number. Just another inmate inside South Africa's prison system. The endorsements had disappeared. The sponsorship deals had ended. The magazine covers stopped. The cheering crowds were gone. The athlete who had once stood beneath the lights of London's Olympic Stadium was now spending his days behind concrete walls and steel bars. For years the world heard very little from him. The story that had dominated front pages slowly faded from the headlines. But one family lived with its consequences every single day. The Steenkamps, every birthday, every Christmas, every Valentine's Day, every anniversary, a reminder that no appeal court, no sentence, no legal judgment could ever return the daughter they had lost. As the years passed, Oscar Pistorius became eligible to apply for parole. The public debate reignited. Should he be released? Had justice been served? Could someone responsible for such a high-profile killing ever truly rebuild a life? The courts had answered the legal questions, but the moral questions, those remained as divisive as ever. Time has a way of changing even the biggest stories. The television cameras leave. The newspaper headlines disappear. Breaking news becomes old news. The crowds move on. But for the people whose lives have been torn apart, time rarely feels as though it moves forward. Years after Reeva Steenkamp's death, Oscar Pistorius eventually became eligible for parole. After an initial application was refused because the court found he had not yet reached the minimum detention period required by law, he later reapplied successfully. In January 2024, after serving around 9 years in custody, he was released on parole under strict conditions. His freedom didn't erase his conviction. He remains a convicted murderer. His release marked the next stage of a legal sentence. It was not an acquittal. It was not a declaration of innocence. It was simply the operation of South Africa's parole system. For some people, that distinction was important. For others, it made very little difference. Because no matter what happened inside a courtroom or inside a prison, one fact could never be changed. Reeva Steenkamp never came home. It's easy in high-profile cases for the victim to become overshadowed by the person whose name dominates the headlines. In this case, that almost happened. Oscar Pistorius was one of the most recognizable athletes in the world. His rise captivated millions. His fall shocked them. But behind every headline, behind every legal argument, behind every television debate, was a 29-year-old woman whose future was stolen. Reeva wasn't simply Oscar Pistorius' girlfriend. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a qualified law graduate, a successful model, a woman who wanted to use her platform to speak about domestic violence and encourage women to value themselves. Those who loved her have spent years speaking not with bitterness, but with remarkable dignity. Her parents repeatedly reminded the public that no sentence could ever replace their daughter. No appeal could undo what happened. No amount of publicity could lessen their grief. Perhaps that's the real tragedy of this story. Not simply that one life ended, but that two futures disappeared that night. One ended completely. The other was transformed forever. Oscar Pistorius will always be remembered for two very different reasons. To one generation, he was the athlete who changed perceptions of disability and inspired millions by reaching the Olympic Games. To another, he will forever be remembered as the man convicted of murdering Reeva Steenkamp. Those two realities now exist side by side. Neither can erase the other, and perhaps that's why this case continues to fascinate people more than a decade later. Not because every question has been answered, but because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. How well do we ever really know the people we admire? Can extraordinary achievement exist alongside devastating failure? And how quickly can a lifetime spent building a reputation be destroyed by a single irreversible act? As the lights faded on the London Olympics in 2012, Oscar Pistorius stood as a symbol of hope. The world believed it had witnessed one of sport's greatest triumphs. Less than a year later, the same man stood before a court accused of murder. It remains one of the most dramatic falls from grace in modern sporting history. But if there's one name that deserves to be remembered above all others, it's not the athlete, it's Reeva Steenkamp, because this was never simply the story of a sporting icon. It was the story of a young woman who lost her life, and a family who have carried that loss every single day since. Thank you for listening to What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. If this episode has stayed with you, please consider following the podcast, leaving a rating or review, and sharing it with someone who enjoys thoughtful, fact-based true crime. And as always, if you'd like to help support the making of these shows, the Buy Me a Coffee link is in the description. Your support genuinely helps the show grow and allows these stories to reach more people. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember, sometimes the darkest truths are hidden in plain sight.